Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. This is a special supplementary episode looking at a unique football season held in 1942 under the most challenging of circumstances. This podcast is usually focused on the history of the AFL/VFL, but I could not leave the year 1942 without honouring this most special of football seasons, one that did not take place in Australia, did not add to any league club's list of premierships, and is not counted in any league players' career statistics. However, it was a season that demonstrated the essence of football, the reason why we play and watch the game, its ability to provide a moment of respite, a time of joy and relief from the most trying of conditions. This is the story of the Changi Australian Football Association and the Changi Brownlow Medal, a competition held in the brutal Changi prisoner of war camp in Singapore. In this modern era, the name Changi is associated with the highly rated Changi International Airport. Yet, when Singapore was under British rule, the Changi Peninsula was the Army's main base, with 3 major barracks and the Changi Jail, a civilian prison, all part of the infrastructure. After the fall of Singapore, Changi became the location of 7 prisoner of war camps. Most Australians were housed in the Selarang barrack in February 1942. Much of the content in this episode is from Roland Perry's book, The Changi Brownlow, which I highly recommend, as well as newspaper reports from the era and more. So how did a football competition take place in a prison camp? Well, first, let's just take a few steps back. At the time of the Second World War, Singapore and Malaysia were both British colonies, part of a network of Asian countries colonised by the British, the Dutch, the French, and let's not forget the US, who had taken the Philippines from the Spanish during the 19th century. Japan began expanding their forces in Asia with the takeover of Manchuria from the Chinese in the early 1930s, followed by an invasion of China that began in 1937. Tensions with America and Britain grew, especially when Japan occupied the French colonies of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, known at the time as French Indochina. While much of France was under occupation, the resources in those French colonies, such as oil, rubber, rice, and more, provided an opportunity for Japan to both represent itself as liberating those countries and their people from the bonds of European colonialism, while also gaining valuable raw materials for their economy and to fuel their war with China. The US saw the move into French Indochina as aggressive expansionism and occupation, so they began to impose trade embargoes. As tensions escalated, some Australian forces were sent to Malaysia and Singapore in 1941 as a precaution against further Japanese expansion. The army units joined British, Indian and Malay troops. Many of the Australians had expected that they would be joining their colleagues fighting in the Middle East, and others hoped that they might be sent to England to help defend Britain or even invade Europe. So when their destination was revealed, after leaving Fremantle, they were a bit underwhelmed. This contingent of Australian forces arrived in Singapore in February 1941 and spent much of the year training in the tropical heat but feeling quite removed from the World War II action that was taking place elsewhere. Some of the footballers that were in this contingent included Fitzroy's Brownlow medalist, Wilfred Chicken Smallhorn, Melbourne's 1939 and 40 premiership player, Harold Ball, who was later killed during the Japanese invasion, Lou Daly, originally from Subiaco, who had also played for Collingwood and Geelong, and Peter Chitty, who had played 2 games with St Kilda in 1936 before injury ended his VFL career. Peter's brother was the infamous Bob Chitty, then playing with Carlton. The quiet times ended on the 8th of December 1941. As Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, the invasion of Malaya also began, and by the 15th of February it was all over. Despite having many more men, the underprepared, undertrained, inexperienced, and poorly led British and Allied forces surrendered Singapore. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced that the fall of Singapore was the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. For Australia, the fall of Singapore was a disaster. More than 15,000 Australian soldiers were captured. More than 7,000 would die as prisoners of war. Families and friends were left wondering what happened to those left behind. Official confirmation of who had been taken prisoners was painfully slow. with little information provided by the Japanese to the Red Cross. But the Japanese did do radio broadcasts, including Radio Singapore, that would often contain information or even short messages from prisoners. A shortwave radio listening service was set up in Melbourne at 375 Collins Street, staffed by multilingual volunteers, listening in to radio propaganda shows from Japan, Germany, and Italy. If an Australian prisoner was identified by name, details were noted and passed on to family members. Often it was the first news they had heard in years, an innovative way to sift through enemy propaganda services for useful information. Changi now became the prison that held Australian and British forces. By mid-June, sport was one way the prisoners passed the time. Cricket tests were held between the English and Australian teams, playing 30-over games that could be completed in an afternoon. This inspired other games of soccer, basketball, baseball, rugby, volleyball, and even golf. 2 Australian football competitions were organised. The initial effort was a 4-team affair, with the sides named after the final 4 from the VFL's 1941 season. This was written up in the Sporting Globe in the month after the war ended, when Private Jim Makem wrote to his brother, Collingwood's Bob Makem, who had played 157 games for the Magpies. The teams in the first competition were Melbourne, Richmond, Essendon and Carlton. Games were played with 2 20-minute halves and each team played each other twice. The lowest team, Melbourne, was then eliminated, while third-place Richmond played Essendon, who had finished second, in a preliminary final. The Tigers won and took on Carlton in the grand final. The Tigers again upset the odds and beat Carlton to win the first Changi Premiership. I'll include a photo taken with the secret camera of the winning team, published by the Sporting Globe after the war, a rare premiership team. A second, more ambitious Australian football competition was also organised, and given the unusual conditions, there was a focus on having clean games. The rugged style of play, often seen in the VFL, with the risk of all-in brawls, would not be tolerated. If the games got out of hand, they would be stopped by the Australian senior officers, or worse, the Japanese guards could intervene. A 3-man tribunal was set up, and penalties would be severe. A king hit meant a fine and a ban for the entire season. The order-off rule was considered, but not implemented. Chicken Smallhorn's playing days were behind him, and he was suffering from dysentery, but he volunteered to be the umpire for the new Changi League. His VFL experience and his reputation for fairness meant he would have everyone's respect. Roy Fox was the other umpire. Chicken Smallhorn suggested an award for the best and fairest player, with the field umpire awarding votes 3, 2 and 1, just like the Brownlow in the VFL. The award would recognise the fair players and emphasise the need to play the game both within the rules and according to the spirit of the rules. It was hoped recognising fair play this way would encourage the right sort of play. Smallhorn then searched for something to replicate the Brownlow Medal. In the British storerooms, he found a soccer medal and modified it. The medal had a decorative scroll which was engraved with Geelong FC in honour of Charles Brownlow's club. The reverse was then also engraved with 1943, the year that the medal was to be presented, Changi POW Brownlow Medal won by. The plan was to present the Changi Brownlow before the grand final, scheduled for March 1943. Things would not quite go to plan. To have a league, you need teams, and the teams need players. There were about 15,000 Australians in Changi, and over 600 men signed up to play in the new competition. 6 teams were established using the names of 6 VFL clubs. Melbourne and Richmond would be made up of players from the Hospitals, Collingwood, Geelong, Essendon and Carlton from the Celarang Barracks. Each side was allowed a list of 30. Matches were 18 a side, with a 19th man, as per the Australian Football Council rules of the time. So, with 6 clubs, 180 players were allocated and 20 were in reserve. An important role, as injuries and illness would take a severe toll of the players, surviving on harshly limited rations. These rations would also play a role in the working of the transfers between teams. Transfers had to be approved by the Changi Australian Football Association, and the standard fee was 3 bowls of rice with a regular small amount of vegetables, an allocation that would feed a man for 3 days in those prison conditions. An open patch of ground was identified for the oval. Bamboo, chopped down by Peter Chitty, became the goal and behind posts. While there were rugby balls in the British storerooms, these were not going to suit the Australian game. So, despite being in a prison camp, this was another example of the trading and interaction with the Chinese residents of Singapore, themselves coming to grips with Japanese rule, but not subject to the restrictions of prisoners of war. Bladders for footballs could be made from the rubber sourced directly from the rubber plantations. Leather needed to be found, also direct from the source. In this case, the wild boars in the jungle. Peter Chitty and Len Lemke organised a trip with a Chinese meat trader into the jungle, joining a hunting party, where Chitty even took one of the rifles and shot a wild boar. If the Japanese found him outside the camp, armed with a rifle, the consequences would have been fatal. But they needed the leather for the footballs. The hunting party scored 4 wild boar, plenty of meat for the trader, lots of hide for the Australians, who took it to the craftsman in town to turn into leather. There was also an order placed with the Chinese seamstresses to produce 250 sets of football shorts and tops for all 6 teams to ensure all would take the field prepared, looking the part of a real football team. Chitty prepared for the upcoming season by training as if he was back in St Kilda in his VFL days, running laps of the camp, push-ups and sit-ups, all on top of the work he was allocated as part of the daily camp life. Stamina and strength had always been his trademarks, and he wanted to be the fittest player in the Changi competition. As an ambulance man, Chitty was part of the Australian hospital contingent, which would have seen him playing for the camp's version of Melbourne or Richmond, until a group from the Changi Geelong team came calling, led by their captain, Lou Daly. Lou had played 92 games for Subiaco in the 1930s, with 2 years in the VFL, 7 games at Collingwood in 1933, then a full season at Geelong in 1934, playing in their semi-final loss to eventual premiers Richmond that year. He returned to Subiaco in 1935, winning the Sandover Medal as best and fairest in that league. The defender knew his football. He wanted to win the Changi Premiership, and he figured getting Chitty into their team would help make that happen. A group of players from the Geelong team made their pitch, offering Peter Chitty the 3 bowls of rice and vegetables, equal to 3 days' rations, the maximum allowed under the competition rules. But still, Chitty declined. The negotiations continued. The delegation asked if anything could change his mind. Chitty paused, assessed his options, focused in on his desire to lead a team given his successful experience as captain-coach for Kajiwa in the country after his time at St Kilda. So he laid out his demands. He would be captain and sole selector, and there would be 2 teammates that would have to join. Ben Barnett, who had been a top player with Old Scotch in the amateurs, and a former St Kilda reserves teammate, Hayne. The Geelong players retired to consider Chitty's demand. Lou Daly was keen to captain. He'd represented Western Australia 7 times, won a Sandover Medal and 2 Best and Fairest awards at Subiaco, and had been captain-coach of Mines Rovers in the demanding Goldfields competition in WA. But he also wanted to win the competition, and he recognised what Peter Chitty could do if he joined their team. The next morning, Daly went to see Chitty with the box of rations, shook his hand, and told him that he was now captain of the Changi Geelong team. The season kicked off on the 15th of August, with Japanese machine gunners overlooking a crowd of about 3,000, as the Changi Essendon and Carlton teams played in the first game. It provided a moment of normality amidst the tension, disease, injuries, work parties, and boredom of prison life. Just as in Melbourne, there were bookies keen to take bets from those in the crowd. In the opening moments, one of the Carlton players was knocked out by a shirt front. A Malay threatened with players running in, but it was quickly controlled by Chicken Smallhorn, bringing out his report card, and men from both teams remembered they would prefer playing football than being suspended. The Japanese guards were bemused by the game, then amused, laughing at these Australians who were bashing each other. The crowd was thrilled with the standard of play in a close game, eventually won by Carlton. The winning punters collected, the players returned to their normal roles, but everyone had been given a taste of normal life, the joy of playing and watching footy, giving a brief but real respite from their daily torment. And there were more games to come. A comforting routine of 2 games per week, giving everyone something to focus on. reviewing the completed matches and assessing the form of the players and the newly formed teams, as well as previewing the upcoming games. A familiar rhythm from their civilian days, lifting morale. The now familiar rhythm of camp life, with the positive influence of the Changi Australian Football Association season, was upended on the 30th of August. After a recent escape attempt, the Japanese demanded all inmates sign a declaration that they would not try to escape. In practical terms, escape was not feasible. While getting out of the camp for a few hours was not an issue, Singapore was an island, thousands of kilometres behind the Japanese advance through the Pacific. Even reaching Malaya meant walking through unfamiliar jungle where local inhabitants were rewarded for turning in escapees and liable for severe punishment for any help to the Allies. However, there was a principle at stake. It was convention that soldiers should attempt to escape where possible. While they were prisoners, the men still wanted to hold onto their principles, their dignity, the few things they could control wherever they could. It quickly became a dangerous standoff. On the 1st of September, the Japanese ordered 15,900 British and Australian prisoners into the Selarang barrack block and parade ground. There were only 3 working water taps. Peter Chitty took 20 men to dig latrine pits 6 feet deep through the asphalt and concrete parade ground. Thousands of prisoners, hardly any water, stifling heat and humidity, and guards with machine guns and mortars surrounding the square. The punishment continued for 4 days. 4 prisoners who had been recaptured after that failed escape attempt, the catalyst for the Japanese demand, were executed by firing squad in front of the men. On the 4th day, with the Japanese threatening to empty the prison hospitals and make the patients march 5 kilometres to the Selarang Barrack Square, and the increasing risk of disease from the already overcrowded, waste-filled conditions, the Australian senior officer, Jack Callaghan, ordered his men to sign the pledge, with the words, under duress, added, making the commitment legally ineffective and holding on to their principles. While that was a legally sound way to hold on to an honoured principle, many of the Australian soldiers had their own way of subverting the Japanese directive. The Changi prison had suddenly become the home for many, many men called Ned Kelly, or Don Bradman, or Far Lap, and some even used Roy Kazali. The football season continued, with Chitty having a fine season. His natural stamina, maintained despite the poor diet and oppressive conditions, allowed him to play as a rover all game, often without any of the traditional breaks in the forward line. By the end of December, the poor diet was taking its toll on those trying to play sport. The rugby competition was resulting in 1 or 2 broken bones per match. While the Australian rules games did not have such a severe toll, there was an increase in injuries towards the end of the year. It did not bode well for the continuation of the season. Doctors spoke with the senior officers, who also spoke with the Japanese. Unknown to the Allied prisoners, the Japanese had their own reasons to keep the men uninjured, not out of concern for their health, but rather to ensure they would be fit enough to work on the Burma Railway. Peter Chitty believed the Australian senior officers also made the decision to end the games. There was plenty of gambling going on, cigarettes being the main currency, which was resulting in ill will between some of the men. Either way, the season finished at the end of December, much sooner than expected. Geelong was undefeated on top of the ladder, 1 win ahead of Richmond, but there would be no grand final to decide the Changi flag. Geelong were declared the premiers, but it was a hollow way to end the season. The Changi Australian Football Association committee met and decided on a way of providing a fitting football climax to the truncated season. There would be a final game of football that would see a Victorian team take on the rest of Australia. The best players in Changi would have one more chance to take the field, and the supporters would see the 2 teams assembled from the best players of the season. It meant that Peter Chitty, captain of the Victorian team, would take on his former teammate, Lou Daly, who captained the rest of Australia. 2 selection panels named the teams that would have the honour of playing in the ultimate game of the season. I have found a list of both sides with some details of the players' former clubs on the internet, and I'll put it up on the grandfinalhistory.au website for this episode. On the Friday night before the game, the Changi Brownlow vote was conducted. Wilfred Smallhorn read out the votes, and his umpire colleague, Roy Fox, tallied them up. Smallhorn sent the medal off to be engraved and then went to the hospital with severe stomach pains. The initial suggestion was food poisoning. Smallhorn said he didn't think they ate enough to get poisoned. It looked like Roy Fox would be in charge of the big game. On Saturday, the 24th of January, 12,500 POWs crowded around the Changi football ground, a bigger crowd than many games during the 1942 VFL season. A band played music as men found a spot to watch the game. A train line above the ground carried over 200 amputees from the nearby hospital. Bookies moved through the crowd, yelling out the odds and taking bets on who would be declared the best player of the day, who would kick the first goal, and which team would win, and what the margin would be. Bets were laid using money, food rations, cigarettes, watches, wallets, and even items of clothing. Bookies were ready for those who wanted a wager. Chicken Smallhorn had spent the night in hospital, was dosed up on the painkillers available, but dressed in white, and he was determined to umpire the game. Most in the crowd had heard he was ill and gave the respected Fitzroy veteran and Brownlow winner a huge cheer. The feeling around the ground was good. They might be in a prison camp in Singapore with no idea what destiny held for them, but this afternoon they had created a world of their own, a space that could remind them of home. The crowd was split between those supporting Victoria and those backing the rest of Australia, yet they were all united in enjoying a moment of release through the simple pleasure of Australian football, their game. The Japanese were taking no chances either. Leave had been cancelled and extra guards positioned around the crowd in case of trouble. The Victorians were wearing blue tops with a traditional white V, as used in many interstate games, while the rest of Australia ran out in sleeveless tops with a red V and black shorts. Perhaps they wore V for victory that day. Umpire Smallhorn called the two teams together and addressed the crowd, asking for quiet. One of the other men who had organised the Changi Australian Football Association was Ben Barnett, a former Australian Test wicketkeeper on the 1938 Ashes Tour of England. He gave umpire Smallhorn a small velvet pouch. Smallhorn passed the pouch on to Captain John Frew of the Australian General Hospital to announce the winner of the Changi Brownlow. Lou Daly was runner-up on 13 votes, and Peter Chitty was the clear winner on 24 votes. He had polled votes in every game that he played. Frew presented the medal to Chitty, and the crowd cheered. It was a popular result, recognising the best player of the season. Smallhorn later said, quote, "Peter Chitty had a magnificent season. I saw almost every game he played. He copped plenty because he was so good. But he was tough, really tough, and fit. In all my playing days, and afterwards as a commentator, I never saw a player with more stamina. He had skill, and he was a born leader." End quote. That's high praise indeed from someone who played the game at the highest level, won a Brownlow medal, even with Hayden Bunton in the same team, and observed the game as a TV and radio commentator for many, many years. Chitty was shocked. As he said when recalling the moment, "I really couldn't believe it. No one had warned me. I knew I had a good season, and I did captain the best team, so we were bound to score more umpire votes. But this was an unreal moment. I was floating." Frew presented Chitty with the medal, now engraved on the back, was 1943 Changi Brownlow Medal, won by Sergeant L. A. Chitty. The crowd gave more cheers in appreciation. Chitty, knowing he had a game to play, then took the medal off and gave it back to Frew for safekeeping, before giving this short speech. "I would not trade that medal for Hayden Bunton's 3 Brownlows." He then thanked Smallhorn and Ben Barnett for their work in organising the football season, before concluding, saying that the two teams should show the gentlemen of the Japanese Imperial Army what they were all about. The crowd roared, and the teams took the field. Chitty again played as a rover, unchanged for the day, running, shepherding, leading, and getting in and under to get the ball out. After a season of being the best player in the game, he was again inspirational. Yet there were good players on both sides. In the first quarter, Lou Daly led from the front for the rest, taking high marks, while for the Vics, John Haig was noted in the official report of the game for working like a tiger in the ruck and was brilliant in the air. The quarter-time score saw the rest leading 2 goals 1-13 to the Vics 1 goals 3-9. As the players moved to opposite ends of the ground, a fight broke out in the crowd. A contingent of Indian guards, who had, after the surrender, defected to the Japanese, took note. The fight quickly stopped. No one wanted to have the game interrupted. The second quarter was even faster than the first. Drop kicks travelled over 50 metres, picking out their intended target. At other times, players leapt in the air, taking sensational marks. There was an intensity to this game that separated it from the club games held during the season. Less than a goal separated the teams as the second quarter wound down. Chitty grabbed the ball, weaved through a pack, took 2 bounces and shot out a 20-metre handball to former South Melbourne player Bobby Mullinger, who passed it on to McGrath for a goal. The bell rang to end the half. Now the Vics were in front, 6 goals 440 to 5 goals 131. Players went to 2 groups at either end of the ground to sit down and take a break. Umpire Smallhorns lay on his back. The painkillers were working, just. Having already thrown up twice, he said, "I'm buggered, but I'm going on." Chitty told his players to keep running and they would wear the opposition down. Lou Daly was louder, telling his players to give it everything in their final game and knock the stuffing out of the Vics. It was a tense start to the third quarter. Players were going in hard with some tough clashes. Umpire Smallhorn maintained control by awarding frees and protecting the ball carrier at all times. As the quarter progressed, the play opened up. Twice Haig kicked to Chitty, who took strong marks in the centre of the ground, but the Victorian forwards just could not capitalise. Later, there was a moment when Haig was surrounded by 4 players, but he beat them all. A few minutes on, he took a fingertip mark and set off a chain of 4 foot passes, leading to a goal that broke a 10-minute deadlock. The third quarter, which had started with a 9-point lead to the Victorians, ended with them now 10 points in front. At the 3-quarter time, Lou Daly made 6 positional changes for the rest, hoping to catch the Vics off guard, and then he fired his players up for one last effort. The aim was to keep the play on the open flanks. Chitty again told his team to keep running. They would win the game if they kept up the pace, because the rest would not be able to maintain it. He may have been talking about himself as much as the Victorian team. And it was the Victorians who broke away first, with John Haig playing superbly and McGrath, the former Riverina player, kicking 3 goals in less than 15 minutes of the last quarter, giving him 6 for the day. It looked like the Vics had the game wrapped up, until the rest scored a goal and began to work their way back into the match. Chitty was everywhere, running, directing players and inspiring his teammates. It wasn't just hard work for the players. Umpire Smallhorn was struggling, touching his stomach in obvious pain as the sweat poured out of his already thin, strained body. With 10 minutes left in the game, Chitty made his move, bursting out of a pack in the Victorian backline, bouncing twice as he dodged and weaved his way up the ground, avoiding the efforts of 2 opponents, then a third, who could not match his pace. Chitty let rip a mighty torpedo punt. It barreled through for a goal to the roar of the crowd. It was a magnificent individual effort by a man who had led his team by example. It felt like the sealer. But the rest were not done yet. Despite the heat, despite the poor diet impacting their condition, this was a game played to the end with full intensity. Lou Daly took a mark, played on and kicked a goal. The game was not over. Chitty spoke to John Haig and sent him into the back line, where he held up several attempts by the rest to move forward. Bobby Mullinger, who played a few games for South before the war and would return for 2 more games in 1946, made his move in the dying moments of the game. Grabbing the ball on the back line, he charged through the centre and booted a long, wobbly punt kick. Peter Chitty was near the goal square. He used his body to nudge his opponent away and then leapt for a mark with arms outstretched. He could now take his time, using up precious seconds that would take away any chance for a response by the rest. And more importantly, he kicked truly, straight through the middle. His second goal in the critical 4th quarter, to definitely seal the game this time. 30 seconds later, the timekeeper rang the bell. It may not have been the official VFL representative side, but Peter Chitty had captained a Victorian team to a 28-point win in the most arduous conditions against the most worthy of opponents. The final score was Victoria 14 goals 93, to the rest 10 goals 5, 65. The crowd rushed onto the ground to congratulate the players from both sides for an extraordinary game of football. Lou Daly was awarded the Little Borehole Trophy, donated by Corporal Little, for the best and fairest player for the Rest of Australia team. John Haig was awarded the Doug McQueen Trophy, donated by former Coburg VFA player, Lieutenant Douglas MacDonald McQueen, for the best and fairest Victorian player. The game was over. Players moved back to their barracks. The train carriage of amputees went back to the hospital. The afternoon had given everyone a break from their reality and almost transported them back to the familiar ritual of watching footy on a Saturday afternoon at home. It would be a cherished memory for them all, and it would never be repeated. While the players and spectators moved back to their barracks, full of conversation about the game and its highlights, umpire Wilfred Chicken Smallhorn was in all kinds of strife. Peter Chitty switched back to his ambulance officer role. He knew something was wrong, and he rushed Smallhorn back to the hospital for a full investigation. Umpire Smallhorn had taken painkillers, been physically ill multiple times during the day, dehydrated by endless sweat in the humidity and the heat. He had said he was buggered, but he had got through the game, maintaining control and the players' full respect throughout the match as he had throughout the season. And he had done it all on this final game of the season while suffering appendicitis. The doctors scheduled his operation for the next day. An extraordinary effort from an extraordinary man. That was the end of football at Changi. The season did not have a grand final, but it did go out on a high. Life for the players and spectators took a turn for the worse after that game. Before long, many of the men were transferred to work on the now infamous Burma Railway. Chitty kept his Changi Brownlow Medal as a prized possession throughout that torment. He did his best to care for his mates, helped by that seemingly never-ending physical stamina that he could maintain under the most trying of conditions. I won't share the details. There's plenty of information about that horrific episode of the war, except to say that Peter Chitty survived. By the end of the war, he and others had returned to Changi, malnourished, unwell, working every day under the harshest of conditions and subject to regular beatings. On the 15th of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito went onto the radio for the first time ever to declare the Japanese surrender. The POWs heard the news via BBC broadcasts on secret, hidden radios, but the work parties did not finish until the 17th of August. From then on, the hospital became the busiest part of the prison camp. Only on the 23rd of August did the camp commandant hold a conference with the senior POW officers to inform them that the war was over 8 days after the Japanese surrender broadcast. Finally, supplies would be provided to the prisoners. Shiploads of Red Cross stores made available. On the 28th of August, nearly 2 weeks after the surrender, an Allied plane flew overhead, dropping leaflets, the first official contact with the outside world. It must have been a confusing time of relief, excitement, and anxiety. They had survived the war, but what was going to happen next? Fred Saker recalled the feeling of many POWs in those extraordinary days. He said, "I had outlived all the attempts of Hirohito and his murdering freaks to kill me, but above all else, I could say no again to anyone and everyone. It is democracy and freedom, and believe me, it's worth fighting for." British ships arrived on the 29th of August, and in September, Peter Chitty was finally able to write to and receive letters from his family. Back at home, Peter Chitty had a younger brother, Bob Chitty. The Chitty family had 4 sons enlisted, with 1 killed. Peter was taken prisoner by the Japanese, and 2 other brothers had also been taken prisoner by the Germans, until they were repatriated in a prisoner swap in 1943. 2 Chitty sisters also enlisted, so the family wanted Bob to stay in Australia. He made his name on the football field for Carlton, and he was also busy in September 1945, captaining Carlton in the VFL finals. We will get to the 1945 season in a future episode, but we can have a little preview given the family connections and a couple of curious incidents as Peter finally began his long journey home. On Saturday, the 22nd of September, a bit over a month since the end of the war, Carlton took on Collingwood in the preliminary final at Princess Park, the Blues' home ground. the MCG still off limits due to military occupation. Meanwhile, Peter Chitty was on the Largs Bay, a passenger ship one day out of Singapore, heading to Darwin. The ship had been in many convoys during the war, and also brought home many prisoners of war, as well as new immigrants in the post-war era. One of her last uses was as a movie set for the 1958 film about the Titanic. But in September 1945, the Australian POWs, and Peter Chitty especially, were focused intently on the radio broadcast from Melbourne. The thrilling description of the preliminary final was a delight after all these years denied Australian football news and commentary. For Peter, it was even more exciting listening to his brother playing a vital role in this critical game. The commentators told the listeners that Bob was injured. He'd sliced the top of one of his fingers in a work accident. But the Chitties were made tough. Chopping off part of a finger was not going to slow Bob down. He had led the Blues back from the brink, on the bottom of the ladder after 4 rounds of the 1944 season, and now they were playing for a place in the grand final. Reception was not always great, and the men jeered when the broadcast faded away and cheered when the sound came back on, then cheered again, depending on whether they were following Collingwood or Carlton. By three-quarter time, it looked like Carlton's run was over. In a game that had seen plenty of fighting and many nasty incidents, the Magpies were well in front, 11 goals 7, 73 to Carlton, 6 goals 9, 45. A 28-point lead at three-quarter time in a preliminary final was going to be hard to overcome. Then, in what must have seemed one of the cruelest of insults, the English captain turned off the broadcast, fearing the violence and excitement was too much for the still recovering prisoners of war. They were left in limbo for some time until word was passed around. Carlton had got up and won, and Bob Chitty was judged one of the best players on the day. There had been plenty of wagers in the game, and most bets were settled in the currency of bottles of beer. Peter may not have heard the exciting final quarter, but he would be in Darwin before next Saturday, ready to tune into the grand final. No hidden radios needed now. They arrived into Darwin Harbour on Friday, seeing the bomb-damaged city with sunken ships still littering the harbour. They transferred to the barracks, and on Saturday Peter was in a hut with some mates ready for the grand final. They had been stunned to discover that no radios were officially allowed in the camp. Officers still apparently fearful that they could be attacked at any moment. So the radio was turned down low as the group sat around the table. One of life's simple joys, listening to the footy while enjoying a beer and a smoke with your mates, was back. Making it better was the fact that there was a grand final and Peter's brother was leading the Blues out again. The 1945 grand final was an infamously brutal game, possibly one of the most violent VFL premiership deciders ever played. At three-quarter time, the Blues were 3 goals up, and South were expected to make a huge effort, given they were favourites to win, and, if rumours are to be believed, there was a lot of money riding on the result. Yet in Darwin, the result was a mystery. An officer had entered the hut and confiscated the radio. Peter Chitty may have been rescued from the brutality of the Japanese, but it seemed nothing could save him from the petty-minded behaviour of some senior officers. They eventually learned the result, a Carlton win, and Peter could celebrate his brother's success and being back on Australian soil for the first time since 1941. Despite twice missing out on the end of the footy due to over-enthusiastic officials, life was returning to a blessed normality. Peter Chitty was reunited with his family in mid-October and had all the emotions, joy and challenges of re-establishing a connection to his wife and the children he did not know after 4 years away in life. None but those who had been through it could understand. Peter was awarded the British Empire Medal in March 1947 for his services on the Burma Railway. The citation for the Empire Medal said, quote, "An outstanding example of unselfish conduct and courage, continuously helping the sick by carrying their kits as well as his own and helping them along and constructing shelter for them while they halted. By these means, he undoubtedly saved lives." End quote. Chitty was just one of 24 Australian prisoners of war to be recognised this way. While it was Peter who received the medal, he always considered himself as a representative of all the men that suffered. While honoured by the Empire Medal, his most prized possession was the Changi Brownlow, It represented his performance in Changi, which was his way of telling the Japanese that the Anzac collective spirit would not be broken. Peter paid a price for his time at Changi and on the Burma Railway. We know now of post-traumatic stress disorder. For Peter, it was nightmares that started decades later, recurring images of horrific situations he had endured, survivor guilt and more. Yet, he also had a good life after the war, found a job, had 2 more children with his wife Lillian, and seemed to bear no grudges against the Japanese. He died in 1996, aged 88, nearly 51 years after being released from Changi. On the 20th of August 2004, the Changi Brownlow was donated by the Chitty family to the Australian War Memorial. The director of the War Memorial, Major General Steve Gower, said it symbolised the Australian tradition of turning to sport to maintain morale. It emphasises the point of supporting those who are in your team. Peter Chitty might have had a short 2-game VFL career, but in a far more important moment of his life, his stamina, physical and mental strength, leadership and compassion, both on the sporting field and in the harshest of trials in Changi and the Burma Railway, he was an inspiration to all that knew him. The Changi Brownlow was a fitting reward and memento of those times. For me, it's also a reminder that the game of football and the teamwork, comradeship and joy that it can inspire is much more important than which team wins. The opportunity to find some relief in a game, whether it be in those terrible conditions or just as a break from the weekly routine, is something to be treasured, and learning about when Australia was at war and the challenges endured by so many reminds us of how grateful we should be for their sacrifice. That's it for this supplementary podcast, and next time we'll be back for the 1943 season. There'll be more information, photos and the team list on the grandfinalhistory.au website for this episode. And as I said at the beginning, if you want to know more about Peter Chitty's story and the Changi Brownlow, I highly recommend Roland Perry's book, The Changi Brownlow. I'll put a link to that in the episode notes as well. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website, Facebook, Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.